All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's roundtable webinar. Thank you all for coming. We are joined today by our hosts, Sam Curry, Chief Security Officer at Cybereason, and Todd Fitzgerald, Vice President, Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative. This session is being recorded, and we'll be sending a link to the on-demand recording in a follow-up email. Welcome again, and with that, I'll hand it over to Todd to kick us off.
Thanks, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here today with this esteemed panel on 2022 CISO Priorities. This is a CISO Stories webinar, which you will also see on the CISO Stories podcast, which is downloadable from your favorite platform, whether it's Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else that you get your podcast from. CISO Stories is where we have been interviewing CISOs for their expertise and sharing their knowledge in actionable knowledge in a vendor neutral manner. And I encourage you to go to CISO Stories, listen to the 25-minute podcast. We'll be putting this down there as well later. I'm with the Cybersecurity Collaborative, where we bring people together to collaborate and to share information and to create actionable information. This is sponsored by Cybereason. Sam Curry is the CSO for Cybereason, has extensive experience in the field. Mark Varner is the CISO at Lowe's. And he comes from Yum Brands and also the global CISO for McDonald's previously as well. We also have Richard Rushing. He is the CISO for Motorola Mobility, a Lenovo company. And we have Sydney Klein, who is the Chief Information Security Officer and the Chief Data Officer, CISDO for Bristol Myers Squibb. And then we also have, last but not least, Devin Bryan with Carnival Cruise Lines, who is also the former CISO for MUFG Union Bank, KPMG, and the Federal Reserve System. So welcome everybody to our panelists and welcome everybody on the call. We want to share today what's going on and how we're looking at different things within each of our different companies. We have different verticals here. We have retail, we have manufacturing, we have pharmaceutical companies, we have cruise lines. And so we're all looking at this in a slightly different way, but we're all facing very similar threats. And so I'd like to have Sam kick it off as we talk about our first topic, which is ransomware and the impact on global stability. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd love to. I will try to set the stage a little bit and hopefully elicit some thoughts from the other panelists here. So if you dialed the clock back to 2019, ransomware had gone from being almost a cottage industry targeting consumers, and we maybe prematurely used the term epidemic in 2019. Because of what it was doing to municipalities and starting to do to healthcare. I think in more recent times, it has grown exponentially. And the real reason is that it makes money. It's also the real reason the cyber insurance industry has started to really pay attention to this. And to put it in perspective, I usually divide ransomware into two components. The first is the delivery mechanism. In other words, how does it spread? How does it reach the target? What are the techniques that the actors here who are profit-minded use to get it in place and have a maximum effect to really make sure that they get the most money out of the system that they can. And then the second is the payload itself. It's worth, while we're talking about global impact, I think last year in 2021, we saw DarkSide come out right at the end of 2020, going into the very first day of 2021. They put a note out to their affiliates, which is almost like a partner network, saying what a great year they had, almost a sort of comic mirror of what we do in legitimate industries. And of course, about a third of the way through the year, Colonial Pipeline got hit, and that got everybody's attention pretty quickly, and including even a hackback in one case, as the government is reported to have gotten funds back from them, ironically for poor security on their part. But we also saw it combining with supply chain attacks, which I know we're going to talk later around Kaseya. And The most recent thing we've seen is wipers, which are effectively, if you go back to NotPetya, it was not Petya. In other words, it was weaponized ransomware. Well, when you don't ask for money and there's no illusion of it being ransomware anymore, you get wipers. And so I often refer to this as ransom ops, because it's not just the malware, it's the whole picture. And we've effectively got to make it disincented to them, seeing as they're financially motivated. But it's highlighted for the whole industry general vulnerability to cyber issues, and it's put a price tag on some of it. And I think that's had a big impact on how we see things. I'll stop there because I think that's probably enough to whet some appetites. And I see some nodding heads and a smile from a person or two, so I'd love to hear what others think.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. I think what it did was it really changed the game in terms of what we were concerned about. So I've been in cybersecurity since 1999, and in those earlier days, until not terribly long ago, we were really concerned with confidentiality related attacks. And now with ransomware and the malware destruction attacks that we're seeing, it really has evolved into availability. Now, being that I'm with a biopharmaceutical company and our mission is to deliver life-saving medications to patients, availability is something that we're incredibly concerned about. We want to make sure that we can reach our patients. And what we've seen as well in this transformation of bad actor techniques is we've seen them go to ransomware and then also add back in this nice element of theft and confidentiality of data as well. So the attacks have certainly evolved significantly, and I think that they require our defenses to evolve as well as our response, and I know we'll have some time to get into that as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Sydney. I think the cyber resiliency side of the puzzle and equation for any organization, whether how big or how small, is now critical of that. And I also think our prioritization on certain items, where, as Sydney pointed out, we were focused on certain areas given your industry and verticals and everything else, and discovered we all knew we had chinks in our armor. The problem is that, well, everybody knows we have chinks in our armor, no matter how it is. And then from a third party and components, we're all leveraging those issues inside of organizations, and you're only as strong as the weakest link. I know it's a very normal thing to say, but this is really true, that I can take a simple third party logistic organization to shut down your entire organization at the same time. And I think those are the levels of components that we deal with. We're really changing the way we're focusing on security and the priorities on that. And I think that's one of the big areas, is that everybody's aware of it and have seen use cases and demonstrations of how this can flatten organizations and take them completely out of the picture on that side of it that's there.
I think one of the interesting parts about ransomware that we don't really think about is it almost gives us a view of how we need to adapt. Because if you think of this is a pivot. In the old days, credit card transaction data was it. And so we got pretty good at that, and we started fixing the PAN, and we started, encrypting correctly and point-to-point encryption and things like that. So if you think about it, it's nothing but a natural maturation process that this is as old as, any criminal activity probably in history. And so as they start to pivot and these things mature and they go to different targets, I do think it, like for what we do for a living, one of the values that we give an organization is start thinking about what is that next level of, so what are they going to pivot to next? Because at some point in time, we can probably catch up with some of these things with the correct controls. And this is all, that cycle starts over again. So I do think it's an interesting window to look at it that way as well.
That's an interesting point. So go ahead. Devin.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I was just going to quickly touch on, impact on global stability, right? When we think about some of the things you said in your opening remarks, Sam, that ransomware, certainly crimes of opportunity, financially motivated, and we place that in the context of, the victims who are typically targeted, right? Or who are typically targeted, because again, crimes of opportunities, right? But most adversely impacted. And we think about the small or medium-sized businesses, right, who are unable to accurately and comprehensively defend themselves. And those businesses essentially being crippled, driven to bankruptcy as a result of, ransomware or wiper malware infections, right? And you go back to what is the impact of that on global stability, right? When we think about the US economy and the fact that small business is really the engine that drives the US economy, right? And, certainly in what we've seen in the uptick in ransomware, destructive malware, the adverse impacts that those attacks have on such a key part of our financial and economic sector, right? So the implications there are pretty huge. I would also highlight the fact that destructive malware attacks were cited by the World Economic Forum, right, among the top 5, right, up there with pandemic outbreaks and nuclear disasters and natural disasters, right? So we think about the impacts, right, on a massive scale of debilitating ransomware and other types of malware attacks on global economic and other stability. The implications are pretty huge.
So Devin, do you think that we're getting better at the ransomware? If we look back, that NotPetya was what, 5 years ago, and when that came about, have we enhanced, and maybe not the small medium businesses, but the large corporations? What have we done differently in that time, do you think, than we were doing before then?
Yeah, I would say that certainly if you don't learn from previous mistakes, you're likely to relive them, right? So I would say that companies, especially those with the wherewithal, and much has been said about the cybersecurity poverty line, right? So I won't spend too much time on that. But I would say that certainly corporations are taking a look at what can they do differently, if not to prevent it, but to minimize the effect that a debilitating attack can have on their, key business operating lines, right? So, stuff like making sure that you've got good backups, making sure that you have good verifiable backups, right? Making sure that to the extent that you can, you are implementing appropriate segmentation throughout your enterprises. Knowing that prevention will fail, right? How quickly can you detect? How quickly can you contain? How quickly can you respond? So I would say, Todd, at a macro level, certainly companies, large and small, should be learning from, past attacks and incorporate some of those lessons learned and best practices to keep themselves, if not ahead of, but abreast, right, of the latest attack techniques.
Todd, I'm gonna say I think that there's some easy wins people have had, and the cybersecurity poverty line, as Devin mentioned, is a huge factor. Mostly what I'm seeing though is people doing the same things, just at more scale or with more resources. And so Devin, I agree with you that they're not doing enough of the, let's not take the prevention mentality, stop the stoppable, let's detect it after, let's catch it further to the left. But what Mark said about really this is a battle of rates, right? It's the rate of innovation on the dark side and the rate of innovation in defense. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that there's this marriage right now of financially motivated cybercrime out for profit that can have a critical infrastructure and economic impact, and that there are some nation states that do what we call state ignored sanctioning, right? If you look at Russia with our evil and Conti and others, it's a synergy. You get the umbrella of a sovereignty, and you get the free license to be a privateer, in essence, as Maggie McAlpine says on my team. This is a perfect storm, and I think it's finally coming to light. It's not just an economic threat. It's not just a geopolitical threat. It's a perfect storm that has these privateers hidden in it.
Mm-hmm. And I think in the beginning we looked at, you know, the backups and making sure that you have those so that you can get your information back, and then we started, you know, getting the double extortion, the threats to post the information out there is another revenue stream for them. Did anybody have any thoughts on how you're dealing with that, or how we should be looking at that?
Well, I'll say that if you think that simply paying a ransom will keep it quiet, it won't. I think like Conti, right? They hack people, and there's a timer until it gets released, so then you get the guaranteed brand impact. But the decision shouldn't be made on whether or not that goes public. You should assume it will become public knowledge. It's just a question of when. And if you're paying to make it go away, you might get a delay of a few hours, maybe a few days. So I think the real question that has to be made ahead of whether or not you pay isn't just in the moment. You have to decide, will we pay? What would we pay for? Is it, you know, human life in danger, public safety? That's my take on this. Do the decision now, and then the double exposure is not twice as bad as single.
The other thing to consider here that I think gets lost in, you know, we talk about ransomware and like all this is new. Perhaps the medium is new, but the motivation is not. Extortion's been going on for hundreds of years. And this is no different than 100 years ago or whatever, and somebody showing up and saying, hey, you've got to, you know, do this or else. So I think organizations probably have more memory muscle for this than they, you know, realize. It's just we're looking at it at a different lens.
Now, I think from the organization and extortion level, it's one of those areas that's there. And I think it's also part of the thing of the uncertainty, because none of this is taken with like, oh, we stole 5 megabytes of data and here's what it is. It's now, no, here's gigabytes, and we have no idea where all of this came from, what it all could be in those areas. So I think that uncertainty side of it leads to part of the paralysis and some of that. Some of it is very much intellectual property that we've seen earlier this month with several organizations taken down by ransomware actors. Even if they weren't affected, their resilience was there, but source code and other things are around that. But I think Mark I think it's an evolution. They're in it for the money, and however they can squeeze money out of the turnip or rock or anything else, they are going to try. If it's not you, it's your partners. And if it's not your partners, it's their partners of their partners. They're going to try all these avenues of that. And I don't think it's going to change. It's just going to continue to evolve. And you have to come to terms with that. And the executive boards have to come to terms with that. And it's not new. If you go back to the original Sony breach, Sony Motion Pictures breach, when they leaked emails on that scared a lot of organizations for that exact function of like, oh my gosh, we could have this happen to us, and this could come across of how we talk to a supplier or what we think about a partner, et cetera, with that. And I think that's part of the same thing of just what were they able to grab and what kind of data is there. But it's the same thing of like, you have to be prepared for this and have to have the bad day is going to be on your doorstep at some point.
Good thoughts. So Sydney, you know, let's move a little bit forward here as we, you know, I think everybody's touched a little bit about the supply chain attacks. What do we do around that? What should we as organizations be doing to help with that?
Yeah, I think that the concept has been around for a very long time. I remember in the early 2000s when Graham Leach-Bliley came out doing assessments of our third parties. And I think the challenge is not enough has changed in that time on the good guy side, if you will, and a whole lot has changed on the bad actor side. And we seem to think that we can assess our way out of the risk. And I think fundamentally, cybersecurity is an unmitigatable risk. And we need to make sure that we don't suffer from a lack of imagination in what could happen. We need to think about the things that seem just downright impossible now and believe that they could happen in the future. And I think that that's a little bit of what evolved in the supply chain attacks over the past couple of years. They really took us as a large industry by surprise in a way. These were third parties that wouldn't have hit on anybody's radar in terms of, oh, I should go out and do my normal assessment. And wasn't that a lesson that we learned all the way back in the Target days? That was years ago, and yet it's a lesson that we're relearning. And I don't think the answer is to expand your scope of how many third parties you assess. I think the answer is to realize that this is an unmitigatable risk, that you need to imagine all of the different possibilities and that you need to prepare for them. And preparation comes in ways like making sure that you have really robust business continuity plans. Our business continuity plans of days old, they contemplate natural disasters. They didn't even contemplate a really big pandemic, and they haven't really necessarily contemplated a systemic cybersecurity incident. And I think back to the question on what have we learned since NotPetya, I do think that that is one thing that we've learned. We've learned the importance of a good business continuity plan. We've learned the importance of good segmentation. When it comes to our supply chain, we also need to think about how do we protect ourselves from our supply chain? How are we connected? We have these huge ecosystems that exist now. And the ecosystems have gotten larger in a work from home time that we all experienced during the height of the pandemic. And so we need to really understand what our ecosystem looks like. We need to really understand what our supply chain looks like. We need to understand our footprints. I mean, this does trace back to, do you have good configuration management? Do you know what systems you have where? Do you know what risks you would have? And then how do you make sure that you have an actionable plan that you can put in place if you do learn that there have been issues within your supply chain? Back to the point of anticipating things that we didn't previously think were possible. Even simple activities like making sure that your system is updated to the latest and greatest. Well, updates aren't without risk. And so what are you going to do to make sure that you're not updating your system and bringing risk in the door? And that just requires a whole new set of imagination. And I think what's really great about the way cybersecurity has evolved is, frankly, I don't think it's just our job anymore. I think that the whole enterprise, and certainly your entire IT department, has a lot to do with making sure that we are protecting against the bad things to the degree that we can, and that we're really rallying around whatever we need to when we detect something really quickly, when we work to respond to it really quickly, when we eradicate it, and when we recover it.
Do you look at your suppliers differently in terms of which ones you're bringing in-house now today than you did before?
Yeah, I think one of the things we really look at differently is how are we working with those third parties? What does the connectivity look like? What would we do if they go away? You know, a lot of times we talk about supply chain impacts infecting the company that's working with those third parties, working with that supply chain. But just as much, we have to think about, what if somebody in our global ecosystem, our supply chain away, what if they're impacted? And so, for instance, in a pharmaceutical, we're concerned about every mile that needs to be driven to take our medicines to patients. Well, what if there's only one delivery driver in the whole country that you're working with? And that delivery driver system, the UPS of whatever country you're in, what if that is hit by a ransomware attack? Well, then how do they know where to pick up product and where to ship product? Those are things that I think we just didn't contemplate before. And so not only are you trying to protect your own ecosystem from any sort of supply chain attack, you're also trying to make sure that you can remain resilient through it. And I think that that's a big change. And that's actually helped in a way with our change management, because it's something that everybody can understand. I remember trying to explain cyber attacks in 2005, 2015 even, and it was a much harder story than now. The news does a great job of helping people become educated, and we have to help them see between each of those headlines, what does this really mean for us and where do we need your help?
Yeah, I think Cindy brought up some really good points, but I think one of the ones that you said is the resiliency factor just as supply chain with COVID, as on top of the ransomware issues, that single source supplier, things around that nature that goes well if they're that. But also, I think it's part of the things that we looked at areas, call centers, outsourced accounts payable, receivable, things that were issues maybe on our radar, but they were never a priority. They were like, oh, yeah, this is fine. Or to Sydney's point, that's very good. What's the connectivity? Do they just VPN in, or they actually have a hardwired to the network that's in the backplane of that? And I think those are the elements that you look at your suppliers, and it's like the questions now become, how easy can I cut the supplier off if something bad happens? And what are the outcomes of cutting that supplier off if they have ransomware, or we spot they have ransomware, or they tell us we have ransomware, or we discover they have ransomware? All those things are all parts of that. You may find out long before they reach out to you and things around that, but it's one of those things. What are you going to do? What are your next steps? And can the business support itself if you take out something that's critical in that cog? Does it mean that I don't ship product anymore? Does it mean there's no manufacturing of anything? Does it mean I can't get paid, or I can't scan a barcode? All those things fall into some of those areas that you really have to think about. And it just as you imagine what the bad guy can do, you really have to imagine that, hey, what would we do if we just disabled our MES system completely? Can operations still manufacture on those sides of it or not? And I think those are things that before you would just think the unthinkable, well, we can't do anything. Now you really got to have some level of a plan, even if it's an outline and not flushed out. You got to have a plan in place, because you don't want to be trying to wing it during parts of this.
I think the other inclination that we naturally go to, and you've heard it here as we talk about them, the suppliers and the vendors, as a lot of companies, I think what a lot more companies are having to take into consideration that perhaps maybe we didn't before is, are you in the supply chain, or are you the supply chain? So as many of us pivot and we become technology companies, it's no longer just a SaaS problem or whatever the case is, but you can literally be bringing this in as well, because what motivates them on the SaaS side is going to motivate them anywhere else as well. And the farther that we shift left, everybody else wants to shift left as well. So that's the other aspect that I think that organizations are more challenged with today to think about, is that it used to just be the third party problem, and it's not just a third party problem anymore.
Yeah.
And sorry, Sam, I keep stepping on.
No, I'm doing it to you. Keep going.
I would add that the fundamental challenge, I think, in supply chain is knowing thyself, right? And knowing thyself, and also thy third and fourth and fifth and on and on and on parties, right? So right now there's a cottage industry around the bill of materials, right? Whether that's the software bill of materials, whether it's the firmware bill of materials, or the digital bill of materials, right? So SBOM, DBOM, FBOM, a lot of folks now are knocking on our doors, flooding our email inboxes as CISOs with solution to the BOM problem, right? Certainly we saw that exemplified with some of the recent, attacks from trusted technology providers, right? And so, certainly being able to know what you have, right? And knowing, what's running, what are the core key libraries, what are the key components of these critical applications supporting your organization, and what privileges and permissions are they running at, right? Even with Log4j, arguably, Log4j was also a supply chain problem, right? But I think that's the fundamental challenge, right, with supply chain as an attack vector. And the strategy around that, I think, takes many shapes and forms. It's, going through the triaging of your third, fourth, and fifth parties based on criticality of what they are providing for your company, and doing the risk ranking and tiering, right? So you can assess appropriately. Sydney's spot on that there's just no way that, you're going to be able to assess security into some of these, right? But by at least knowing, right, you can then start using the information to drive decisions around how do you kind of triage and risk rank and prioritize the protections of your supply chain.
Devin, do you think we're going to see this explosion of security questionnaires with more and more questions attached to them?
It's a great question, Todd, and I'd be interested in getting my esteemed panelists' thoughts and perspective on that one too. Because you think about the questionnaire, to any of the providers who just experienced who are just the sources, if you will, of the recent major supply chain breaches, what would their response have been to that question, right? Are you verifying your libraries? Are you verifying your code? Do you have integrity in which question on that questionnaire would have elicited the appropriate response to you as the CISO would go, well, I think we need to walk away from this provider, right? So, I shudder to think that, folks will see this as an opportunity to add more questions to those vendor questionnaires.
Yeah, I think that would absolutely be the wrong answer, and I know that it's happening places. I think it could actually be the right approach for us to decrease the number of questions. When we look at SolarWinds and how that got to be, and I won't name any names here, but the group who's credited with discovering it, would any one of us have found something in an assessment of theirs? Absolutely not. And so that just shows that the idea of asking more questions is wrong. Now, when we look at SolarWinds themselves, I do think that there are some fundamental questions that we could have asked to get an idea. And I think that one of the main opportunities there was making sure that there was the right support for a security program within the company. But it kind of comes back to the basics. It's not whether or not you have all of the bells and whistles and all of the latest and greatest products, of which there are many. It's really about, do you get the fundamentals right? Do you have the right people asking the right questions? So you got to make sure that that's done. You got to have your business continuity plans, and you've got to protect yourself from your ecosystem.
Yeah, I think
I would just want to add to this. Look, Devin referred to third, fourth, and fifth parties. That's an expanding tree, and the quality of response and dialogue that you have goes down with the number of parties involved. Now, I've already seen an explosion upstream, and I'm doing it to my partners too, right? I'm asking questions. But I'll give you an example. A very large insurance company asked me, do you have older operating systems no longer supported? To which I said yes, because I have customers, ironically, like the company asking me, who have those platforms. And I said, I put them in a lab, they don't connect to anything else. The response came back, that's unacceptable. Would you consider, no longer having them and retiring them? I said, absolutely. Would you consider removing them from your RFP? They had no idea what I was talking about, like nothing, right? So if you ask questions, it should be to encourage rich dialogue, and we shouldn't be bayoneting the wounded. We should, the comment earlier about when do you get rid of them because they didn't do something, and the answer should be not. It should be a conversation about, so what's your compensating control for that, or how could we mitigate the risk, rather than, oh, you don't do that, because we've all done this, right? We've all put a process in place where somebody has to hit approve, and they do it so often they just hit approve. You're going to get the same thing in responses. They're just going to say what they need, especially more risk tolerant, smaller companies that it's life and death. They're just going to say yes. So it's not helping anyone.
Yeah, the binary questions that are like, do you not, or sometimes, or always. These are the things that are there. And oh yeah, please fill in the next two sentences that tell us why. I'm like, what are you going to get out of those kind of scenarios of like, I can't explain it. I need like 4 pages. Can I add stuff into the, oh, well, you can, but it's back to the same thing. They're not expecting that. And I think that's the portion of a lot of the questions we were trying to do. We were using the, for lack of a better term, the questionnaires as a smoke test. to basically say, hey, is there a fire here? Or it's smoking, say, oh yeah, they don't have a really good discipline. We probably should do a deeper dive on some of those things. That's what the questionnaires are really from, not to say these are yes, these are no on these parts of it. And I think those, it just take it for what it was. It's a smoke test. If we see something that's fishy or doesn't add up or doesn't come through, and to be honest with you, a perfect score, I don't trust, because I'm like, you're not telling me the truth if you're giving me a perfect score on this side of it that's there. We all been there. And I think those are the issues that come across of like, we're trying to take something, a different tool or what we want a result for and try to use it for something else as a risk mitigation side of it. Say, hey, we answered the questions and they didn't answer the question correctly or didn't have the right person or anything else. And at the end of the day, you're left with, okay, you got a piece of paper. Did it have any controls or anything else that are going to give you some legal foot? Probably not. So the answer comes back to the other side of it is like, what are you going to do about it? And use it for what it is. It's like, hey, it's just a smoke test to see if there's problems. And if there is, we can do a deeper dive. But I think it's back to understand the Log4j, perfect example of that. Of anybody looking at this open source group that was managing that would have never, ever used it that's there. They would have said, no, this is too young, too weak, not enough organized development. So well, no, it's not, but everybody did. And there was a lot of large organizations that used it on top of that. So their due diligence was nowhere near that of what it should have been. And yeah, that's hindsight's 2020, but I think that's what we have to do is try to focus on what really matters in that at the top level. What are you trying to accomplish with that? What is the goal? And if your goal doesn't align, then you're doing a lot of extra work for nothing.
Yeah, very, very good comments. I think the supply chain brings us to another area that with the priorities that we really need to be discussing, and that's incident detection and response across our network and in the cloud. Mark, what sort of thoughts do you have around how we manage this environment where everything is moving further and further away from us?
Yeah, well, I think the first recognition you have to have is to realize that that is the case. All right, so first confronting the issue of the fact that you're probably not in a cloud. You're probably, hybrid cloud is, one of the challenges that you're probably going to face. And then you also have ghost IT and all sorts of things like that are just traditional problems that you have to bring into that. I think one of the larger things that's going to challenge a lot of organizations moving forward is just that. It's the wide net that we're now talking about, and being able to, I've always thought of this as like a game of needle and haystacks, because what you want to get back in is the information that's really, really important and actionable. The problem is there's thousands, if not millions, of triggers that are going on out there, right? If you look at any of your devices, they can produce a log that will fill up a room in paper in a matter of seconds. So the real challenge, I think, for most organizations is how do you take that data and then bring it in, what is information or data, and then take it in and make it actionable and meaningful. And the other big challenge is doing that at scale, with all of the environmental challenges, right? Because there's a financial aspect to dragging all that stuff back in that you just can't get around, and you really can't afford to do all that. So how do you do that out at the perimeter so that as you start bringing that in, and you can do better incident detection and you have better, telemetry as to what's going on, balancing that with, what can you get in functionally, what can you afford to do, I think is one of the the big challenges that most organizations, especially at scale, and the wider the network goes, the more networks that you have, the more cloud environments you're in. It's just becoming more and more complicated every day, and I think that that's one of the big challenges. The other is, do you use inherent tools, excuse me, or do you use your tool? Because if you're in cloud environments that have a lot of those inherent tools, the problem is that if you're in hybrid, now you've got multiple tools that you're having to train and then bring back and normalize that data. Throw on top of that privacy concerns, which now have a great restriction as to what you can and cannot take and things like that. I see that as probably some of the organization's biggest challenges moving forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Mark. I mean, certainly for those of us operating, still in an on-prem environment, however, multi-cloud, right? With endpoints, networks, applications, and data, all a part of our remit, right? And having that real time, right? Because cyber attacks propagate at the speed of light, right? So, thinking about how do you automate the detection, the containment, the response in as real time as you can is to your point a significant challenge. I don't know that we can backhaul that data on-prem to the SOC anymore, right? We have to leave cloud data in the cloud and use it in its native format, leveraging it there along with the rest of your tooling, right, to drive automated remediation as much as possible, right? Because I think for quite a while yet, we're going to have to, as cyber defenders, being able to defend, that environment that you touched on with our on-prem systems, our cloud-hosted systems, and multi-cloud hosted systems, and layering on our security stack on top of those environments and enabling us, and our teams to respond at wire speed is critical, right? So, we have to get the human out of the loop in those environments, right? And drive as much automation as we possibly can, because these attacks are propagating at wire speed, and getting eyes on glass to say, is this good or is this bad? Depending on the nature of the attack, of course, I think is, to your point, a challenge of scale, of speed, and automation definitely is our friend in that instance as much as possible. Sorry.
So Devin, I'm going to push back a teeny bit on that. I think automation is a virtue because of the efficiencies it gives us, but what we actually want is the efficiencies and better applications of human beings. My fear with blind automation is that it becomes a predictable response to an attacker and can therefore be used, right? There were some organizations in the ransomware case that were saying, if we have a case of ransomware, let's minimize downtime, let's automatically re-image those machines. And so what did the advanced attackers do? They dropped ransomware as they were doing an advanced attack to clean up the forensic data, because then they knew somebody would come along and just re-image the machine. So I would caveat what you said with, let's automate the automatable and make sure we're always checking the blind spot, how it might be being used against us. And let's focus on efficiency, and automation should serve that. Just like when a vendor says machine learning, or AI, it's like, okay, how does it help us until we've solved the Turing challenge? How does that help us actually fight intelligent opponents who could be using automation against us?
Sam, do you think more organizations are going to be?
Sorry, let me just finish, because Sam, it wasn't quite a pushback, because I did not mean to imply we're going to automate the analyst. That was not my proposition at all. To your point, automate the automatable, right? And certainly look for efficiencies as much as you possibly can. I might not have stated as well as you did, but that's exactly the point I was trying to make. So thank you for clarifying. Sorry, Todd.
No, it's okay to have a difference of opinion. I mean, we
final's fun.
Clearly do. Yeah. It's human nature. Do you think all of this is going to push us more towards organizations doing more outsourcing of the whole security operations piece because of the, Devin, you spoke of all those complexities and automating on-premise and in the cloud. Do you see that being more managed with, and I think Mark was mentioning all the different tool sets that where organizations are going to be looking at this and saying, I really don't want to deal with this, as to have the backhauling and have that both ways, or are we looking at some sort of a hybrid model where we're managing that, having a small team on site to manage the critical pieces?
I think it depends. I'll tell you, I think that there's a huge benefit in hybrid. And the benefit that you get in hybrid is that you have some internal experts who really understand the company and the business and what you're doing. But by leveraging outside resources, one, you are tackling some of the challenges that we know we all face when it comes to finding the right talent and bringing them into the organization. I think when you're looking at hybrid, perhaps a security company that specializes in these security services might offer better career track for an individual in that space. But the benefit that comes to people like us to go in a hybrid situation is that then you're not just seeing what your company's seeing, you're seeing what all of their clients are seeing, and that's really priceless. So I'm a big proponent of hybrid. I do hybrid. I've done it before. I've done only outsourced. I've done only insourced. I actually really like hybrid and think that there are a ton of benefits to the organization, especially as the talent challenge is evolving, and I'm not sure it's getting any better yet.
I think the hybrid model actually is the true model, or if you want to call it a fusion model. It's the same thing of like, I may have the expertise on staff. They can't scale. If you have more than one incident a day, okay, guess what? Everybody's busy on that, and I can't scale those out. And I think that's a normal business. I think the other side of it is as COVID hit and everything else, and we displaced out of our offices, the telemetry and everything else dramatically changed with where we're trying to do, and that the 24 operating hour model, et cetera. If you weren't, you now are. And I think those are the issues where you are pulling in resources, and it may be one organization, but it may be 5 or 6 organizations to say, hey, we're in 3 separate clouds. Maybe we should, and oh, there's not one organization that is going to be good at all 3. So let's pick the 3 that we're going to go with and see what pulls that information in. But I think it's back to the same model, is that, hey, doesn't matter who or where, it just matters getting the data and prioritizing the data that's actually there. But I think one of the biggest issues, as Devin pointed out and everything else, it's also the response. Just because you know there's a problem, how are you going to respond to that? And that's one of the key areas which in today's world is you didn't think it was a problem, and now it's no longer someone gets on an airplane and flies somewhere. You now have issues of like, wow, maybe I need to be in region, in country. Even with some of the data localization laws, you're like, well, maybe I should just leave the data here for this, see where it's going to go. But I think those are the issues that pop in.
So with that as a backdrop, we talked about the cloud, we talked about the incident response of that, information across multiple clouds, multiple places. I want to kick it back to Devin and tell us, how do we make sure that we're ready for this incident response? What does that look like for our organizations as we move into 2022, and we want to make sure that we've got a good organization that can respond to these incidents that are going to come?
Yeah, so there's this great poet, the name will resonate with you guys, and he said, everybody has a plan until they're punched in the face, right? So that was Mike Tyson, right? Everybody has a great plan until they're punched in the face. And so I joke a little bit about it, but you need to be prepared. You need to have a plan for how you're going to respond, right? So we know that prevention will fail, right? So, we have to pour into how do we respond? How do we step through, the detection, the containment, the eradication, the recovery phases? NIST did a great job several years ago, decades ago, I think, in creating, NIST special publication 800-61, I think, the incident handling guide. That does a pretty good job of cataloging that for us, right? But that's the guide, goes to your incident response planning, but then being ready to respond when bad things occur. That's where you have to build muscle memory throughout the organization by exercising, like the military said, train like you fight, right? So simulations, tabletops, they do have a role. They do play and should play an important part of your crisis planning, right? So, teasing people through who gets to make the call at what point, who gets notified when, right? What's the sequence of activities that we will initiate if that happens and that happens? All that is golden, right, in building up that organizational capacity, building that muscle memory that gets folks ready to respond in the thick of the fight, so to speak. So in a nutshell, Todd, it's the Boy Scout approach, right? Be prepared because things will happen, and the more that you have exercised those muscles, the easier the response will be when that bad day occurs.
Sam, do you have any tips for us?
No, the only thing I would add, because this is wonderful commentary, is I think there's a call to innovate, and it applies to all the conversations we've had so far. I'll give an example. I won't belabor it, but indicators of behavior, right? We tend to think of the MITRE ATT&CK framework in your head. We think of columns and techniques. What we're really talking about is chains of behavior going horizontally across it, and we need a query language. We need to be able to share those and to be able to build on them and build logic around sequences of behaviors. As an example, there are many we could put out there. If you're interested, that's work being done in a vendor neutral way in the Oasis group, but it could apply to tons of things. I think to some extent, we're not thinking about how do we change the game or what are the missing pieces. We all know the pyramid of pain. The tippy top is the TTPs that are so hard to do and so valuable and yet have so few tools, right? What do? We all share IOCs and stuff at the bottom of the pyramid of pain, the hashes, the domain names, the URLs. We need to be doing more innovation in the places where it's harder to do the work and the payoff is bigger, right? Let's get all the commodity stuff and start to, you're supposed to spend less on a commodity year over year. Let's shrink that down. If something's available everywhere and the same quality from everywhere, pay less. Look, you're going to pry the SIM and the antivirus out of my cold dead hand, but I shouldn't pay a premium for it, right? Let's innovate and let's enable new companies to bring new innovations. And I don't think enough of that is happening right now. There's a lot of startups, but how many of them are doing things that are truly innovative?
No, I totally agree with Sam, because one of the things that you have to remember is these ransomware organizations, they're using playbooks. Step 1, do the following. Step 2, do the following. These are not the high-end attackers or anything else that are there. They're following a cookbook recipe. And if you know what the cookbook is, guess what? You can see if they're in your organization, because they're not going to go off script on any way, shape, or form on that side of it that's there. And I think that's, you hit the nail on the head, is that we focus a lot of times on things that are easy to collect, but not really practical to your organization that's going to make a difference to not get infected or detect earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is that I think that a lot of organizations underestimate the practice. And I think Devin's points on this were really important here, because in the court of public opinion, I think that the tide has shifted from, I can't believe you let this happen, to, wow, you had a really bad response. And so the breaches of the past years that didn't go well, they didn't go well because the company had a horrible response. They weren't good in a crisis. They didn't know what to do. They were unethical. They were not transparent. And so practicing is incredibly important. And I think practicing at all levels across the organization. Devin, I think also pointing out knowing who gets to make the call when, so that you're not surprising people when you say, hey, as CISO, I made the decision that I've cut this part of the network and I'm sorry that that impacts you. There's no time to go and get the checks. And then the last thing I'll mention here is really thinking through your communication plan. That's something that if you don't have, I would really invest the time with your corporate affairs team, because you really want to know, what would your position be? What would you say if pressed in a certain area? How transparent are you going to be with your constituents? How does this tie back to your company values? And the great thing I think about what we do is that things have gotten easier for us when we make the decision. A lot of times we can just have to look no further than the company value and mission statement, and that makes our decision for how transparent we want to be, which is, I think, very transparent with those that we serve.
Great insights, Sydney, and I think it all comes down to the people, right? Which is really, I think, the last thing we really need to address. And I'm really going to cut this short because I know our time is running out. I think we could talk for hours with this panel. This has been so insightful. Rich, I want 30 seconds or less.
Sure.
You've got to attract the best workforce in cybersecurity today, and you want to steal people from Mark and from Sydney and from Devin and Sam. So how are you going to get them? 30 seconds. What's your view?
You have to have a plan. You have to show things of where the organization's going to go. People want to be on a winning team. And if you're doing budget battles or trying to figure out, no, you can't stay here, you can't work remote, you're not in this, all those things are going to be impactful to your organization. There is someone that is going to offer them more money and things. So it's not a money exercise. Yes, it is. Salary is important, but it's everything else that is important around that is going to keep the people there. But it also is going to attract people to the organization that you want to work for. It's not all about money. It's really about a lot of different things. If I bring you in and I say you can't go to any training, you know what? Guess what? I'm going somewhere else. You really have to support lots of different initiatives, and there's plenty of them out there for those people that are there that are going to grow and become, and they have to have a career path. If you're just, hey, you're going to be an analyst and someday you'll be a SOC manager, but I can't tell you when or how that's going to occur, there's nothing in it for them. They're going to find it.
Great insight, Rich. So Mark, how are you going to compete with Rich?
I think, one, you have to be creative with hiring. The days of the ready-baked security person are kind of over, and you really need to be, there's lots of other places that you can pull people from and resources from, and I think that we've been too narrowly focused, historically speaking. And then you have to invest in them, and they have to know that, really know that you're putting that time and investment in them so that they can better their skills, and I don't think it's fancier than that, honestly.
Sydney, where are you going to get your people from?
Mark is spot on. We need to think about hiring in different ways. We could throw out all the statistics about how there are so many unfilled jobs. And I think that it's our job to create the talent. So I want to hire people who are hungry to learn this area, who are interested in it, who have a great growth mindset. Maybe I'm looking at places of tangential skill set. Maybe I'm just taking a leap on somebody who really wants to get into the field and has showed me how they'll go above and beyond to learn. But the thing that I think will differentiate all of us amongst each other from a company perspective is, what support do you have in your company? What is the culture from a cyber perspective? Do you have support from your management and from your board? And I know I would much rather work in a place that I feel the full support of management and the board behind me in the tough decisions we have to make.
Devin, what are your thoughts?
Just to double click on everything, echo everything that my esteemed panelists said, definitely emphasizing the non-traditional recruiting paths, our veterans, our females, the Latino serving institutions, the female serving institutions, historically Black colleges and universities, give them interesting work, align them to a mission, and watch them soar.
Great advice, everybody. Sydney, Mark, Richard, Devin, Sam, why don't you bring us home here? What are your thoughts on this?
On this one, I'm gonna say one word here: story. Right? Story, or I could say narrative. Your company, whether you realize it or not, has a narrative. It could be good, it could be bad. You should take conscious control of it. Your team has one, and your people have them. So you really need to share it. You have to live it. Take the time to write it out, and don't do it as a work of fiction. You can be aspirational to some degree. What do you stand for? What is your vision and mission, and where are you going, and do you live it? Right? The company obviously has to make money for shareholders, but we're motivated by stories everywhere. We watch the news for a story. We honestly watch reality TV for stories, but we even do development around stories, literal stories now in agile development. So take the time to know it, and then you can refine it, and you can make these things come true. But when people join as the retention, you should know their narratives, right? Everything that I heard here was, where do they want to go? How do they want to live? How do they want to expand? What do they stand for? In the end, you pay enough and you get obviously as generous as you can and appropriate. But after that, it's what team are they part of? What story are they part of? And how is their story evolving? And that's what I would add.
Well, I just have to say, you know, from everybody's perspective here, I would want to go work at any of your companies with the thoughts that you have laid out there. Thank you very much. I know we're out of time here today. I know we could talk longer about these issues. I think we hit on some major issues, priorities for this next year that we need to go after. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Cybereason. Please download the CISO Stories podcast. It's where you can get actionable advice from chief security officers and other security leaders in the industry that have built a lot of these frameworks that we're working with every day, and get real actionable advice from that. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a membership organization which also creates a lot of products for CISOs to leverage from, and has been very useful. I know each of you have been involved in that and provided those insights in those deliverables to really democratize security so that everybody can take advantage of it. And that's really what these organizations are about. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks to my panel.
Thanks.
Thanks, Todd.